We'll get to that racist trope in just a moment. But first, another poll shows President Trump has a lot of ground to gain in order to win re-election, and how poorly he's doing compared to President Obama at this point in the 2012 cycle. The NBC News Wall Street Journal poll found the president's approval rating at 45%, within the range of other polls this year. His disapproval stands at 52%. Comparatively, in July of 2011, President Obama had a slightly higher 47% approval rating with a lower 48% disapproval. But in hypothetical general election matchups, Trump loses handily to Joe Biden by 9 points, 51 to 42. Bernie Sanders bests Trump by 7 points, 50 to 43. And Senator Elizabeth Warren, I thought he wanted to run against her, tops Trump by 5 points, 48% to 43%, while Senator Kamala Harris has a 1-point edge over the president. In the July 2011 NBC Wall Street Journal poll, President Obama was leading Republican Mitt Romney by 7 points, 48% to 41%. So, Joe, the president not faring well against candidates he was laughing at one point.
Well, that he was laughing at, that he's still attacking. And again, let's put up these numbers again. And what it shows is Donald Trump getting beaten badly at this point by Joe Biden, 9 points. And by the way, Joe Biden's beating Donald Trump badly after turning in a poor debate performance. We often talk about how the past Joe Biden has run ineffective campaigns. He's stumbled over himself. He's had bad performances that ended his presidential run. I can't help but think that the age of Trump allows Joe Biden to make mistakes and be unscathed, because whatever Biden or any other Democrat does, it pales in comparison not only to the racism, but to the generalized ignorance and the poor performances that Donald Trump puts in. About the same time, Mike Barnicle, that Joe Biden was having a terrible debate performance, a day or two later, Donald Trump went on Fox News and rambled and bumbled his way around, suggesting that actually littering just was created 2 years ago in big cities. Right. So he has set the bar so low, I'm not so sure that there's much a Democrat can do to not be hurt. And again, you look at these numbers. Biden up by 9, Bernie up by 7, Elizabeth up by 5. These are all Democrats Trump has mocked endlessly, and even with the power of the presidency, he still trails them, and he trails Biden very badly.
Yeah, Joe, and what he's done effectively, and not for the first time, he is the only story in this country, Donald J. Trump. I mean, this was a truly, deeply depressing weekend based upon that tweet that he put out. Basically, the President of the United States saying to 4 women of color, go back where you belong. I mean, who hasn't heard that in the past in this country?
Well, we're going to talk about that for a second, Mike, but tell me what this, I mean, that's a great example, though. That's going to be our next story, but that's a great example. Once again, Donald Trump dividing up his 41, 42, 43% on one side, and on the other side, well, my gosh, if you're a person of color, if you're in Wisconsin, if you're in Michigan, if you're in Pennsylvania, if you're in Florida, you stayed home in record numbers when Hillary Clinton ran for president. Are you going to stay at home to not vote against Donald Trump?
Well, you would hope not, but you know, who knows? I mean, what he's done is, though, he continually focuses on a third of the population of this country, his base. He has no interest in expanding his base. So whatever Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, whatever they say or do, whatever they do in the polls, up, down, whatever, at this stage it's meaningless, because everything is focused on Trump and his mistakes in terms of understanding the country and sort of campaigning as president of the United States rather than president of 1/3 of the country.
Yeah, you know, Claire, it doesn't make any sense to me. Donald Trump with this strategy will win Alabama. He'll win Tennessee. He'll win Missouri. But, I wonder if Trump's not just making the same mistake every politician makes, every general makes. They fight the last war. He ain't going to have James Comey dropping a letter 10 days beforehand on Joe Biden. He's not going to have the mistakes made by the next campaign that Hillary Clinton's team made on the last campaign. I'm even guessing that Joe Biden or whatever Democratic nominee gets the nomination, they'll probably do polling in 2020, unlike Hillary Clinton's team. And I think, the guys fighting the campaign, that's why this base strategy for winning states Republicans hardly ever win is so surprising to me.
It's interesting because if you look at what he's done as president, he has stayed so focused on the people in those rallies. He loves the rallies. He loves the fact that he can pack people into these buildings and that they can say lock her up and all of the inappropriate things he said that they roar to. He is so hooked on that when he is making policy and when he is typing with his thumbs in his bathrobe, he is thinking of them instead of those voters in suburban America that are totally offended by the way he conducts himself in office. He's making no attempt whatsoever to be president of the United States. And it is fascinating to me that even in the face of this polling that shows that he is historically deeply unpopular as a sitting president, and that somebody who identifies the word socialist in their title is beating him by, 6 or 7 points. I mean, this is nuts. This is nuts. It's really interesting to me that there is not more of a fire drill going on, but it is who he is. And let's just hope now we stay united and stay focused on the prize here, because if our party doesn't stay focused on the prize, we could make mistakes and could end up throwing this presidency in his lap for what would be a disastrous second term.
So, Jonathan Lemire, you've been covering the president for quite some time. Is Claire right? Is it all about the rallies? Would he rather have a lot of cheering at the rallies and move beyond the 42, 43, 44%? And is that why he keeps making these inflammatory remarks, these racist remarks that, again, get bigots stirred up at his rallies, but keeps him below the threshold he needs to get to win in 2020?
The president views it this way, that in 2015, 2016, during that campaign, he focused on what has now become his base. Certain people who identify with his anger, with his grievances, with his hardline policy on immigration. Yes, sometimes the racist comments.
By the way, Jonathan, can I correct you? It's not his anger. He's a poser. This is all posing. I mean, I just wanted to throw that in. You don't have to agree with me, but his alleged anger, he's playing this populist role, and he's playing his supporters as suckers. But anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Joe, it's your show. What they see as his anger, how they interpret it. And he said that was a pretty narrow view of the electorate last time around, and he won anyway. So his sense, and the people around him are, we're going to stay with that. There has been no effort to grow his base. He does love the rallies. He tells people all the time that is his favorite thing as president, is to go to a hall, whether it's in North Carolina or Virginia or Wisconsin, whatever it may be, and get up there and perform. He feels like that energy. He feels like it's an energy, it's enthusiasm. He believes that he has people who come to those rallies who aren't being picked up in the polls. And to be fair, he was somewhat right last time around. And he thinks that he can do that again this time. Now, his political strategists think that they want him to tone down some of these controversies. They want him to focus on the economy, which remains his best argument. They want him to go to these handful of battleground states that are going to decide this election. He spent Friday in Wisconsin. I was along for that trip. And he did. That day, he stayed on message, pushing about trade and tariffs and the economy. That's what they want him to see and stick with. But he seems incapable of doing that. And just in the last few days, think of the controversies he's had to deal with. The resignation of Secretary Acosta in the wake of the Jeffrey Epstein scandal on Friday. His stinging defeat with the census decision also on Friday. And of course, most damning, the racist tweet from yesterday, which was meant to try to further a divide among Democrats, one that he had somewhat effectively played to a few days earlier between Speaker Pelosi and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her cohorts. Except, of course, this time he went entirely too far and instead given a gift to Democrats who will certainly reunite in their condemnation of what he said.
So, Miko, again, we talk about signal and the noise. I know we need to talk about this because this is just pure out.
Well, we can cover it all, including Jeffrey Epstein.
We can talk about that. But let's also, again, before we talk about these tweets, let's talk about why he did it. Well, he
D-squared.
He told his people He told his people that he was going to fight to get his question on the census. Then the Supreme Court said no. Then he told his people he was going to hold a press conference, and he was going to actually put it on there and defy the Supreme Court. Then he weakly and meekly backed down, like, as he might say, like a little baby. He backed down. That was one thing he did. Also, he had to fire Acosta. Why? Because Donald Trump knows that as long as Acosta's there, people are going to say that man called Jeffrey Epstein a terrific guy. That man invited 25, 26 calendar girls to Mar-a-Lago for a VIP reception. But it was that man and Jeffrey Epstein alone at that Mar-a-Lago, quote, party where those two old men had 26 young calendar girls swirling around them. He doesn't want us to talk about that. He wants our hair to be on fire about the census. What else does he not want us to talk about? Well, you know, Jonathan mentioned it. I mean, this has been a very rough weekend for him. These ICE raids that were supposed to materialize, they never materialized. We're getting reports that the numbers were far below even what Barack Obama did. So this has been a disastrous political weekend for Donald Trump, where he's looked weak and meek, and in Donald Trump's words, like a little baby. And so what does he do? He says, I'm going to fire off some tweets on Sunday, and the press is going to follow him around, and that's all they're going to talk about money. Now, we're going to talk about him right now.
Oh, we will.
We're going to talk
just
about him
one
right
second,
now.
though, because I have a point to make.
Yeah.
The point you made. You talk about that man and the party he had with Epstein and that man. Let me just tell you, there's also the math that America is doing when he says Donald Trump hiring someone who a lot of people seen as completely inappropriate as his labor secretary. Interesting, because you just wonder what kind of favor he was doing for Alex Acosta. Like, what kind of connection did they have that he thought he needed to hire him as labor secretary? And if you watched on Friday, he and Alex Acosta walking out onto the White House lawn around the press and saying this was his idea for him to quit. Very nervous around Alex Acosta. I just don't understand the connection there, which is why we'll cover all these stories, and we'll continue to.
If you back out to 30,000 feet, he hired, as a guy, Secretary of Labor, he hired a guy who lied to young girls who had been raped.
Very nervous next to him.
And lied to about young girls who had been raped, about that he would stay in touch with them, but he made a plea deal that made justice impossible for them to get.
What's going on there?
And he's standing next to a man who was running buddies with Jeffrey Epstein for quite some time. So, yes, I suspect Donald Trump has a reason to be nervous, has a reason to set out incendiary tweets on Sunday morning. So we're not talking about what happened Friday afternoon.
Exactly.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.